Well, hi everyone. Here I am with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson for part 9 in our series of rewriting history. And this one, we're going to look at the Chinese connection to Europe, to ancient Europe. I mean, this is going to be very interesting, Dr. Jeanson, looking at Chinese and their connection to Europe. But before we do that, what you're really doing in this series is showing that when you look at genetics, and in some of the programs you did look at the mitochondrial DNA that's inherited through the female, but the Y chromosome of the male actually is able to be used in a much greater way and a broader way. And looking at the mutations that you see there and comparing that around the world and the similarities and differences and so on, you're actually able to work out relationships and closeness of relationships and history. And when you look at all of that, it actually fits into biblical history, starting with God creating Adam and Eve, and then the flood about 1700 years later, and then 8 people giving rise to people who went through the Tower of Babel, and then all the different people groups we see today. And what you're showing is that the differences we see in cultures, even though they might look enormous when you look at even their style of clothing and their sculptures and their buildings and so on, all of that can develop really quickly. And you don't have to go too far back in history to realize that these people are much more closely related than we think. And so now you're going to do part 9, part 10, which will be tomorrow, will deal with, well, the pre-Columbus time in America, in the Americas. And that's going to be very interesting as well. I think this is all going to blow people's minds. And again, rewriting history, but not rewriting biblical history, rewriting what people perceive as history that, well, we're finding out is not quite so. So over to you.
Very good. And what we're seeing is something that would have shocked me several years ago. We've talked for many years rightly about the difference between origin science and operational science. What we're seeing in this series is someone's view of origins has dramatic consequences right now and in recent history, how we understand historical events, which is still a historical question, but how we understand DNA differences, how they arise, what function they have, what sort of relationships they imply ethnically. There's a tremendous influence of one's origins views, and I would argue, and we'll see this played out over and over again in this series, if you adopt the evolutionary timescale, there's a tremendous amount of history that you miss, a tremendous amount of information that you're unable to access with this stretched out timescale for humanity. And these discoveries that we're seeing, again, this is information you'll find only here. It's new research that rewrites so many of the stereotypes we've held about who we come from and who we are. This is only visible if you adopt the young Earth timescale, the 6,000 year, and for the flood, the 4,500 year timescale. And what we'll see again and again is this is not something where it's a circular argument and you assume the Bible to prove the Bible. It's you start with this framework and suddenly the events of known history pop out from the data, events that even evolutionists would recognize that they haven't been able to see before because they've stretched out this time scale, they've stretched out the family tree, and it's invisible to them. So this is all part of the larger question of who do we come from? As Ken has already mentioned, there's all sorts of differences among us that we see. If you're a creationist and you're watching, you know, okay, this goes back to Adam and Eve ultimately, more immediately Noah and his wife, his sons and their wives, 8 people. And we know after that there's the Tower of Babel, and rightly that we viewed this as the start of the ethno-linguistic diversification that we see today. There's been a lot that's happened after Babel. If you look just at the language side of the equation, there's over 7,000 languages in the world today. There were probably about 70 units, language units, based on Genesis 10 at the time of the Tower of Babel. So God divided people initially that way, and there's been even more diversification in language since then. There's been diversification ethnically as well, and connections among peoples that we haven't seen before. And what we focused on at the start of this series, and what we'll continue to do, sort of as a general rule, is to look at people groups today, the connections among them, and work our way backwards in time to the beginning. And eventually that raises the question of how do we connect to these ancient cultures? I'm American on my dad's side, several generations. I'm half German on my mother's side. She came over when she married my dad. And so I've got a strong European connection because of that. And despite the European connection, I don't think of myself as the descendants of ancient Greeks or ancient Romans or some of these storied cultures of long ago, because they weren't in Germany, so to speak. And I definitely don't think of myself as connected to the Egyptians or to the Persians or to the Babylonians, because to me they're geographically distant from what I think of as my own heritage. Yet what we're going to discover is that this sort of implicit disconnect is wrong, and there's many more connections among us than we've previously thought. I've promised early on in this series that we would be discovering several remarkable facts about human history and human ethnic identity that we hadn't known before. And we're beginning to see the delivery on these promises. So we're still going to find out that there are such a thing as black-white people. And I don't mean that black-white people exist. We're all various shades of brown, but in the popular sense, black-white. What I mean is there's Caucasian peoples walking around on Earth who think they've had Caucasian ancestors for thousands of years, when in fact you go back a few hundred and there's Africans in their family tree and have been Africans for thousands of years. They're descendants of African peoples, yet they're Caucasian today. They don't know it. We've discussed some of the principles of how this might occur in previous episodes. We've also begun to see see the delivery on this promise of the fact that most Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry, not long-standing so-called Caucasian European cultures. We began to see that in episodes 7 and 8 with Eastern Europeans and their connections to South Asia. We've also seen the beginnings of the fact that genetically European nationalities, strong, proud heritages that people claim, Italian, Spanish, German, those disappear within a few generations, going back a few hundred years in the human family tree. We're also going to look at, in future episodes, the history of the Americas before Columbus. Next episode, we're going to look at the history of the Americas after Columbus, because even though we think of that as obvious and perhaps even boring, because we know the history, genetics demolishes what we thought was true in a profound way. Again, we're going to look at it before Columbus as well. And once we get back to the earliest parts of human history, the ancient history, we're going to examine and re-examine Neanderthals, who they were, what they represented. Popularly in mainstream circles, they're viewed as primitive, part of the evolutionary ladder leading to humans. They're part of the inevitable march of progress that's intrinsic to the evolutionary model. Well, what happens if you view this through the lens of the Y chromosome, the biblical framework, which has echoes of human history stamped through it over and over again? How does that change? We're going to look at that in future episodes. And my goal in all of this is that we'd marvel at who we are. Yes, that we'd gain apologetic tools by which to defend the Bible. And if you're not a creationist and you're watching, that you'd gain some provocative new scientific points to cause you to rethink what you've held to be true. But that for everyone, we'd stop and say, wow, this is amazing. I've never thought of myself, my heritage this way before, that you'd rethink your loved ones, and you think of the cultures and peoples around the globe differently. I think this casts missions even in a new light. Yes, we go to all the world, and there's often culture shock that's associated with going to a new culture. Once you begin to see people as much more connected, my hope is this will transform how we live our day-to-day lives with the peoples that are around us and even those people that are far away. One of those cultures that's been far away for so long, at least to the Western world, and that has a very ancient history, is Chinese civilization. From the Great Wall of China that was built in part to keep the northern tribes out of China, to the Great Terracotta Army, monument to one of the Chinese emperors, to the Buddhist influences on China and dominant religious structures there that's different from the dominant Western religious structures and influences, to their language that's tonal and character-based. So much of China, to Western eyes and ears, is exotic and decidedly non-Western. And historically, especially if you'll know this if you've read the history of missions in China, notoriously, historically, China has been very isolated and resistant to Western influences. So part of their isolation is self-imposed, and their exoticness is a consequence of that. And if you've read Hudson Taylor and such, you know that the Chinese resistance to the foreign influence was a challenge early on in the days of doing missions there. So this isolation would naturally lead us to conclude that when West and East met, particularly around the time of the missionaries of the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was once again a meeting of long-standing separate cultures. Yes, they may have been connected through the ancient Silk Road commercially, but by and large, they live their lives separately. Never the two shall mix until modern technology, the modern era, and even in a sense, there's sort of this echo of the evolutionary inevitable march of progress. Now, finally, these long-standing barriers have been erased. Well, genetics takes that idea and demolishes it. Just to review where we've come from so far, we saw in episode 1 that the world is smaller than we think. You go back a few hundred years, there's 20 times fewer people alive back then than today. And so if you're looking for a spouse in the 1400s, you've got a lot fewer options. So you can either marry someone that maybe is closer to you, a closer relative than we today might be comfortable with, or you look outside your group, which if you look outside your group, this is now going to start connecting the people groups of the world. We've seen that a similar conclusion follows from doing the math of each of our own family trees. If I take my own ancestors backwards in time, 2, 4 great-grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 1632 backwards it goes. You go back 800, 1,000 years, and I've got, in theory, more ancestors than are people alive in the globe at the time. That can't be true. The only way to solve that math problem is to make the branches of my family tree, going back just in the AD era, 1,000 years, they must connect. My parents must be more related to each other than I think. You apply that math around the globe, this implies that so-called racial or ethnic change has happened repeatedly throughout history and happened quickly. And we've looked at the genetics of that in episode 3 and seen just how plausible that is. We've also seen that if you have 2 different ethnicities coming together and they have different rates of bearing offspring, some have more, some have less, you can get a dramatic reshuffling of the ancestry of these people. In theory, it's possible most Europeans, even though they look Caucasian like me and Ken, have had African ancestors, and most of Europe has had African ancestors for thousands of years. That's theoretically possible. We've also looked at DNA clocks, and really this is the crux of what we're doing and will be doing going forward. There are clocks within our cells that tick every generation. This is both a complex and simple fact of biology. If we look at how different or closely we are genetically, this tells us something about our family tree. The principle is very similar to basic family trees. The more DNA I have in common, let's say Ken and I have a lot of DNA in common, we have a recent common ancestor. If we have very little DNA in common, we have a very distant common ancestor. That's the basic principle for reconstructing the family tree of peoples around the globe. We've seen that we can't use the DNA that you typically analyze for commercial DNA testing. You pay $100 and family tree DNA, and one of these other companies will tell you, oh, you're this percent European, this percent Western European, this percent German, Irish, French, Dutch, so forth. We've seen that that can't tell you much more beyond 4 or 5 generations. To go back into deeper history, you have to use DNA that's inherited only from one parent. Otherwise, the other parent dilutes the DNA signal very quickly. Mitochondrial DNA, the female inherited DNA, the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, both of these genetic compartments in theory fulfill this requirement. We've seen though that it's the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, that is the key to human history. It's got much more fine detail that we can see compared to mitochondrial DNA. Both indicate that our family tree goes back just a few hundred generations, but it's the Y chromosome that's the key. And just to reiterate from episodes 5 and 6, to go from Noah, 8 people, to the nearly 8 billion people alive today is just 200 generational steps or less. So boom, 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 and you're there. And if you try to do that in your head, 8 billion and shrink it down to 8 in just 200 steps, you realize you're going to have to start connecting the tree really fast, which means we're going to be much more related than we think. And we've seen some of the ramifications of this theory in practice, looking at the first branches of the human family tree, beginning with the lost relatives of Europe. We've seen that there's connections between Great Britain and India that are probably not due to the arrival of the East India Company in the 1600s on the shores of India. This is likely due to the incursion of the Mongol Empire into Eastern Europe and some of the spillover into Western Europe. It's then the Mongol Empire then being pushed out by the Russian expansion, Mongols going down into India and starting the Mughal dynasty, the dynasty that rules right before the British come. All these events, it appears, have connected the people of Europe to the people of Central Asia, some of the Middle East, and India in the recent past, within the past 500 years. This is not something we'd expect naturally. It's consistent with history. It's a real shock to our senses. I want to continue this story of shocking connections between Europe and other civilizations around the globe by looking at an ancient Chinese connection to modern Europe. And if you know the history of China, if you know the history and have studied archaeology, you know that archaeologists speak of cradles of civilization, those places around the globe where state formation and the earliest signs of organized society occurred. In the first example, you may have heard of the Olmec civilization in Mexico. This is the cradle sort of in the New World. You might be more familiar with the ancient Egyptian Nile Valley civilization. I can think back to my own high school world history course, and we open probably with creation and the fall and corruption, confusion, the catastrophe, the flood, and Babel thereafter. I don't remember very well them connecting this to Sumer. It's like we just suddenly start at Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, and tell the story from there. And part of what this series is going to do is help make a clearer step-by-step link between the events of Babel and the events that we know from world history. One of the other cradles of civilization is this Indus River Valley in Pakistan and India. The last one, though, as it relates to our discussion today, is the Yellow River Valley civilization, one of the cradles, one of the first starts. And if you've studied Chinese history, you know it's very unlike European history, where you're constantly having different groups fighting with each other, one replacing the other, first the Greeks, then the Romans, and the Germanic barbarian tribes, and the Vikings at some point. It seems like a continuous state of chaos, where someone's ruling, but then it's someone completely different. China, on the other hand, has a long string of Chinese dynasties for thousands of years, with some brief interruptions. So this timeline here, from the beginning now, going down through these years to the end, is in a sense Chinese history in a nutshell. The earliest dates, though, at the Xia XIA, I'm not going to do a great job pronouncing these, not being a native Chinese speaker. That and the Shang, these earliest dates and times are, even within the mainstream community, subject to dispute. There's written records that they're debating whether or not these are actually historical or somewhat mythological. Right now, it looks like they accept the Xia as legitimate, the Shang as legitimate. We're going to revisit some of these early dates in later episodes once we get back to the earliest stages. I want to point out, though, a few interruptions in this lineage that might hint at connections to Europe. Around the time that Alexander the Great was going on his dominant conquest from Greece all the way to the borders of India, the Zhao dynasty was being interrupted by the spring and autumn or warring states period. This then later gave rise to the Qing dynasty, during which the terracotta army was built. Then the Han dynasty. Han is significant. It's around the time of Christ. Han is significant because many modern Chinese would call themselves of the Han ethnicity. Following the Han ethnicity, this is around the time in Europe when the Roman Empire was being overthrown by invaders, Germanic tribes, and invaders from Central Asia, the Huns. Invaders from Central Asia were going the other direction as well and wreaking havoc in China. And this is a period that's significant. This age of division for several hundred years is one we're going to revisit shortly. The last major interruption that I'm going to draw your attention to is actually shown as part of the continuous series of Chinese dynasties here. The Yuan dynasty is actually the Mongol rule of China. We discussed in the previous two episodes the Mongol rule, their massive empire from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Well, they reached down into China as well and ruled there for a time. In terms of the geography of China, so that timeline doesn't tell you how much of this area of China each of these dynasties rule. One of the early ones, the Shang one, the second in line there that I showed, ruled just a small territory here around the major river valleys. By the time you get to the Qin, think the terracotta army, still pre-time of Christ, still BC era. They're ruling more of the eastern seaboard, but not yet the full modern Chinese geographic realm. By the time of Christ in the Han dynasty, it's more expansive. The Tang, 700 years later, you can see it's occupying a good chunk of the modern Chinese, communist Chinese realm. Even though by the late 1500s, you still don't see the full geographic extent of modern China. It's the late 1800s where you see the Qing Empire dynasty ruling over not just modern China, but modern Mongolia. And then, of course, today we have Mongolia as a separate country, communist China, its own country as well. To understand not only the political history, but the genetic history, and this is one of the areas of our investigation where we'll see some really significant overlap. The factor that I think plays the most dominant role in all of this is the geography of China. This is a somewhat exaggerated map of the globe, but helps highlight some of the key features, especially as we think about Eastern Asia, that play a role in the history of China. So I mentioned earlier, you think back to missionary history, around the late 1800s, there's resistance to Western influence. That is a long-standing practice in China, and geography is one of the bases for it. So let's look at what constitutes the geographic elements of the modern Chinese realm. You'll notice here in the west is this massive uplift, this Tibetan plateau. The borders of it represent the Himalayan mountains, the tallest in the world. In the north, you have the Taklamakan Desert. Both deserts and very high altitudes are not conducive to human flourishing. We can survive there, but it's not a great place to grow a lot of food and support a large population. So, not surprisingly, even to this day, you do not have very many Chinese people here. The billion people in China are concentrated in the eastern part, and it's the eastern part, of course, you can see here is green, fairly flat. It has the rich agricultural potential, and that's been the long-standing sweet spot for China. This feature not only discourages human occupation, it discourages invasion. So part of the reason I think China has been so isolated for so long is the geography that protects them from foreign influence. Actually, it's the combination of protection and fertile river valleys that allows them to focus on self-strengthening and other inward-focused movements. So this protects from invasion from India, and you can see it played out in history. You don't see any history of India invading China or vice versa. There's too many geographic barriers in the way, even though in terms of distance as the crow flies, they're fairly close. It's this that says, sorry, you're not going to get the army across it, so that never the twain shall meet. Go around this way, you run into water jungles. This is not a very promising path to get into China. Of course, if you go south and east, it's lots of water, which is again a great barrier, especially in pre-modern times, as a barrier to invasion. Historically, where China has been vulnerable has been invasions from the north. Now, it's not that there's a whole bunch of fertile river valleys up here. This is essentially Siberia. It's bitter cold, but the nomads that have roamed Central Asia, raised horses, raised sheep, and were always looking for pasture, and eyeing the rich valleys down here, of course, then had a military interest in getting into China from the north, and China built the Great Wall in part to try to keep them out. So this isolation, which I've said politically, so this geographic isolation, I should say, which we've seen has strong political ramifications, political isolation, we can also see reflected in genetics. So here's sort of an exception to the rule. We've seen the beginnings of European intermixing with peoples around the globe. Well, what we're going to see here in China is a strong isolation at the genetic level as well. The 1,000 Genomes Project that we discussed previously, we're going to look at the family tree based on it again, but this time focus on these royal blue stars. They looked at 5 East Asian populations, Japanese, Vietnamese, and 3 Chinese populations. The Han Chinese in Beijing, the Han Chinese in southern China, and the Dai minority group here in southern China as well. You'll notice on this family tree that's based on it, and I haven't taken all 1,200 men from the study, I've taken about 500 representative individuals. You can see there's blue down here, blue here, but there's a great big chunk of blue here in the middle. And that's where I want to draw our attention first. This particular section of the tree has the biggest echo of Chinese geographic and political isolation. You can see just how much of the screen is blue. This is the O haplogroup. Now, I didn't give the name for the subgroup of the tree that we discussed last time. I'll discuss it shortly here in a moment. I just want to describe here the system. This is not so that you have to remember it every time. I'll say the names, the letters, the designations each time we discuss it so that we're all following. I'm mentioning it more so because I'm sure there's some folks watching who've done genetic testing. They may even have some information on what Y chromosome group they're in. Well, you can now begin to use the information we're discussing to say, okay, this is my heritage. This is my ancestry. These will become useful to you, and especially for viewers who now might be prompted to go get some sort of genetic test, especially a Y chromosome test. This will begin to help you understand, who do I come from? Who am I? Who are my ancestors? So this particular section of the tree is called O, the major branches of the tree, subdivisions near the beginning. Mainstream scientists have given arbitrary single letter designations. And so this branch, you can see its root is back here, and then it starts flowering into this branch, these branches down here. This is all considered O. Now, the system then for labeling specific sections of the tree is once the major branch starts subdividing, then you add a number. So this might be O1, O2, O3. Well, this branch up here then is now subdivided into this, this, and So this section might be O1A, and this is O1B, and on it goes. You keep adding letters and numbers as it gets subdividing, so you can know at a glance if someone just gives you the name designation where you are. I want you to see, though, the individuals present in this tree. And just like we saw for Europe, there's a whole multiplicity of them. All 5 East Asian groups are present. The Han from Beijing, China, Han from South China, Japanese, Vietnamese. As we scroll down some more, we're going to see the Dai minority group. Notice as well, though, that just like we see for Europe, within a short time, all these various ethnicities come together. These various countries come together. You lose national identities very shortly at the genetic level. You can see then green there were some South Asians, Bengalis from Bangladesh. I think those are probably a consequence of the Mongol conquest. We're not going to discuss them further because they're such a small percentage of the total. I want us to focus on the big picture ramifications here for East Asia. There's the Dai again, the Vietnamese, and on down you go. Whole bunch of East Asians. So that's the right side of the tree, the more recent history, where people come together, ethnicities disappear, just like for Europe. I want to now draw our attention to the other side of the tree, where this all starts. This is a fairly deep branching tree, and you can see this branches off from another major grouping all the way back in 1000 BC. So why is this significant? Well, this particular group, O, represents over 90% of the 1 billion people in China today. Massive representation, over 85% of Vietnamese, over half of Japan. So I said China is isolated. What's also significant is what you don't see. You don't see Europeans. You see hardly any of those dark green South Asians, no Africans, no Native Americans. This is the living representation of thousands of years of Chinese isolation. Their geography keeps invaders out. Their fertile river valleys keeps the people in, and you see that reflected in their genetics. An ancient, isolated history. Well, why would we talk about a connection to Europe then, an ancient Chinese connection to Europe? What we've seen so far is that at the political, geographic, and genetic levels, there's strong isolation. Why might there be a European connection? Based on everything we've seen, we wouldn't expect a European connection. And if that's the assumption we carried into this, we'd be right in thinking that. But if we gaze deeper at the tree, we'll find out that once again, these logical assumptions turn out to be wrong. So I want to draw your attention to a section of the tree that has both blue and gold and is the basis for an ancient Chinese connection to Europeans. This is what we call the N group. Again, just an arbitrary letter to designate a deep branching structure of the tree. Let's zoom in to see who's on it. This particular section of Europeans is dominated by Finnish people. I'll give you the percentages for various groups in a moment. You can see though as well, they're connected to Beijing, Han in Beijing, China, some Vietnamese. There's again another South Asian individual, an Indian Telugu, who happen to be residing in the UK. Again, my assumption is this is probably due to the Mongol conquest. We're not going to talk about it more right now because my focus is elsewhere. This particular group of Europeans, in this case dominated by Finnish people, breaks away from these East Asians around AD 600. That's a date we'll keep in mind in a moment as we look back at Chinese history. Now, I want to emphasize again, this is research in progress. So these are dates that are round numbers. Take it with a grain of salt that may revise as we get more and more data in, and as we get a better sense for where exactly in the tree Noah is. I've got it narrowed down to a small region. I don't know exactly where precisely in that region Noah is, and that affects the dates slightly. But we're going to go with the data that we have at the moment. And in terms of percentage representation, this particular branch of the tree represents a whopping 60% of Finnish people in this study. We're going to see in a moment that it represents about 1/3 of Eastern Europe as a whole. It's also strongly present in Siberia, and it's got a gradient of percentages in China. Now, again, 90% of China, more than that is this O group, so this is only a small fraction. Yet within this small fraction, there's a geographic gradient that represents a clue to the origin of this branch, as well as to the origin of the connection to Europe. So we've seen a connection to Europe. Why in the world does it exist, and how in the world did it come about? This is where I'm going to go to the other study that we discussed. The 1,000 genomes was wide, I should say it was narrow, and it focused on only 26 different people groups, and then deep because it took 50 people from each on average. This one is wider because it samples many more ethnic groups, but shallow in that it takes only 2 to 3 men. So they give us different windows into human history. I want to draw our attention again to this group N, which in this study, because it has Siberian peoples, you'll see there's a lot of pink showing up here intermixed with the gold. We're going to zoom in just so you can see who these individuals are. Now, if you're like me, most of these names wouldn't have mean much some time ago, because I haven't studied Siberia until I was forced to recently because of these DNA connections. And you may have never had to study this as well. So just so you're aware, there are Evenki people, there's Yakuts, Mongols might be familiar. But again, in pink, this is all basically groups in Siberia, modern Russia, but not necessarily ethnically Russian. Tuvenians, people in the tundra, even some of these Eastern Europeans, because they're ethnic minorities in geographic Russia and other Eastern Bloc countries, aren't as familiar. They're present here as well. The Maras, the Bepsas, the Udmurds, Maras, and on it goes. And here are some of the others in the tree. You can see there's even an occasional Middle Easterner that shows up. These might be more recognizable. The Estonians, Latvians, former Russian republics. The Sami people are the very North Scandinavians. So again, a heavy Eastern European emphasis, because this particular study did a lot of sampling in Eastern Europe and also looked at Siberia, which they're lumping Mongolians into the Siberian group. Now, I'm drawing our attention to this particular study because there's a clue in the groupings among these people. Notice that if you draw a vertical line right about here, it naturally divides this tree into a cluster of Siberians in pink, a cluster of Europeans, cluster of Siberians, Europeans, another big cluster of Europeans, and a cluster of Siberians. As if this is a point where they kind of form their own branches, or where there's a split. In terms of dates, this is around 1600. If we think back to the history of Russian expansion that we discussed previously, I find a very intriguing correlation. The Russians moved from west to east, from around Moscow eastward through Siberia to the Pacific in the 1500s, and 1600s, they're in Siberia. So the correlation between the dates for Russian expansion and the intermingling of European and Siberian lineages seems to fit this history and naturally suggests an explanation for it. It doesn't answer all the questions, though. Even though there's some intermingling that's consistent with Russian history, the question still remains, who do these people come from? Are these ethnic Russians that moved into Siberia and then became the ancestors of modern Siberians? Or is it the reverse? Russians came in and started intermixing with Siberians, and so Siberians became the ancestors of modern Russians. If we go back to that tree from the 1,000 Genome Study, the Finnish connected to a bunch of East Asians down here in royal blue. I have a hard time seeing how the Russian expansion could explain some sort of East Asian connection. Siberian, sure, because they're geographically there, but East Asian, that makes me wonder. Now, here's another clue that if we take this particular branch even further back, that I think reveals what the answer is. This particular group that I'm labeling N finds as its closest ancestor Group O. That 1000 BC point that I said is the beginning of this Group O, 90% of China and basically only East Asia, has ancestry, ancient ancestry, with a group that also contains East Asian peoples and Europeans and Siberians. And I'm saying this data, this particular data set, shows the split between the branch leading to Europeans and the branch leading to the East Asians around 600. And remember from the other study, there's a whole bunch of Siberian groups intermingled here. So my suspicion is, given the connection back here to O, is that these are Asians in origin, probably Siberians, perhaps those who are Siberians that were close to China and intermingling with them, and eventually became intermingled with the Russians and other Eastern Europeans because of the Russian expansion in recent history. So is there anything in history, Chinese history, that might tell us about interactions between East Asians and Siberians, or northern, northeastern, north central Asians, that might explain what we see here? Thinking back to the history of China, again, the invasions tend to be, because of the geography, from the north. It's hard to get into China from the west because of these desert high mountain barriers. Hard to come in from the east because you have to throw all your army in a boat, then invade from this direction. If you can come around from the north this way, though, and down, now you might have a path in, and China recognized this and builds a great wall. Well, 600 AD is around the period of the Age of Division. Remember, again, this is the age in Europe where there's Central Asians coming in and overthrowing the Roman Empire. The other side of Asia, in the eastern part of Asia, not only have the Central Asians invaded China during this age of division, they are ruling parts of northern China as dynasty heads. So even though the Chinese, the Great Wall was erected to keep them out, they were sitting here ruling parts of China and likely intermixing with them. Originally Siberian, Central Asian in origin. Here they're intermixing with the Chinese, and it's at the end of the 500s, early 600s, that a southern Chinese dynasty, the Sui dynasty, moves northward and kicks the Siberians, the Central Asians, out, which would then presumably stop some of this intermixing. The specific people group around this time is the Shanbei. Linguistically, they have connections to Central Asia. This seems to be a good candidate to explain what this particular branch represents. They come out, Central Asians, morphologically in terms of appearance, look rather Asian, we'd say, in terms of their ethnicity. We looked at their deep branching, and it looks like they share a common heritage with the Chinese in ancient times. They've been intermixing with the Chinese, at least until the 600s, and then they've been sitting up here in Central Asia, Siberia for some time. Eventually the Russian expansion happens and they intermix there. This again represents 60% of the Finnish, a third of Eastern Europe, a good chunk of Siberia, and even though it's just a small fraction of the Chinese, there's a north-south gradient, and I think this fits this explanation as well. The invaders come from the north, they're sitting here in the north, not the south, intermixing with the Chinese, and the southern Chinese come up and kick them out, and so you'd expect the southern Chinese to be less intermixed than the northern Chinese, and the Han Chinese in Beijing, up here in the north, have a higher percentage of this ancestry than those in the south, so I think that fits the history as well. Regardless of which specific historical event is tied to this, what we've seen though is this N group looks like it's Central Asian, far Northeast Asian in origin, which means then that the data we learned and the conclusions we reached in the last two episodes, that a third of Eastern Europe has Mongol ancestry. This is the branch that's typically called R1A, and again, the major branch is R. It's subdivided into group 1 and then subdivided further into group A. We're going to look at R1B in the next episode, which is a heavy presence in Western Europe. But I want to focus on Eastern Europe for the moment. A third of Europe is in this branch, which is Central Asian in origin. A third of Eastern Europe is in this N branch, which is Central Asian, Siberian in origin, which means a full 2/3 of Eastern Europeans have recent Asian ancestry. And looking at that particular N branch, which has more recent in the 600s, 500s connections to China, also an ancient connection to the dominant lineage in China, Eastern Europeans, by virtue of this particular branch, also have a genetic connection to ancient China. So we're beginning to see now, at least in Eastern Europe, that the majority of these people, even though they may look Caucasian, look like me and Ken in their genetics, have a recent Asian origin. This is not stuff we'd expect to see, but this is part of the new history of the human race, shocks from genetics, now that we can see them and have the right time scale in hand, conclusions we can reach that we wouldn't have reached otherwise, just focusing on the political history of people groups around the globe.
And Dr. Jeanson, if you think about the evolutionary history, supposed evolutionary history, going back to, out of Africa idea and as man evolved and so on, and we're looking at, how long ago do they say man evolved out of Africa?
200,000, 300,000 years ago, incomprehensible amounts of time.
Right. When you then look at that and you look at the genetic differences and the short amount of time it must have taken for those differences to arise, and looking at that from a scientific perspective, there's no way what you're saying fits with an evolutionary history. You just can't fit at all.
I was working on preparing the presentations for talking about the pre-Columbian history and reviewing what the evolutionists say about the history there. They say, for them, it's a very late event, an arrival in the Americas 15,000 years ago in evolutionary terms. But the first civilizations are around 1900 BC in their time scale. And it hit me, they say they came over and then basically did nothing for 11,000 years. And then suddenly civilization started. And I just scratched my head and said, how does that fit anything we know about the world? We just sit there and do nothing for 11,000 years, and suddenly humanity, boom, explodes, and here we are today. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it struck me in a new way, and I think that applies not just to the Americas, but all around the globe. Hundreds of thousands of years of basically nothing, and then civilization explodes in the last 3,000. That just doesn't quite fit my intuition.
No, it doesn't fit at all. Well, we look forward to part 10 and part 10 tomorrow night. And part 10, you wrote down as the hidden history of Americans. That's going to be very interesting. Looking at before Columbus and who
After
actually,
Columbus.
after Columbus and
Yes.
before Columbus.
And then in future episodes before Columbus, we're gonna take the bull by its horns.
This is going to be very interesting. Okay, we'll look forward to part 10. Thank you again, Dr. Jeanson.